In the sweltering heat of a Washington summer, top trade negotiators from the Canadian government descended upon the U.S. Capitol for several intense days of meetings. They huddled with key figures in the Trump administration and influential members of Congress, all as the calendar ticked inexorably toward the August 1st deadline, a looming threat designed to avert a punishing 35% tariff on a wide swath of Canadian goods. The atmosphere was charged, a high-stakes poker game where every glance and word carried weight. President Donald Trump, never one to mince words, had already set the tone in his characteristically blunt style.
"We are looking for the best deal for Canada," he declared.
But then pivoted sharply, admitting that the United States hadn't necessarily prioritized this northern neighbor in its trade agenda. More provocatively, he suggested that a negotiated deal might not even materialize.
"We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada," Trump mused aloud. "I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs. It's not really a negotiation."
This rhetoric wasn't just idle chatter, it was a calculated jab, underscoring Trump's willingness to wield tariffs as a blunt instrument of economic pressure. Yet from Ottawa came a response that was as cool as the Canadian winter, a firm, unyielding statement from the Ministry of Finance.
"We will only sign if it is the best deal for Canada."
This declaration, delivered without fanfare or histrionics, sent shockwaves through the White House corridors. It effectively dismantled the August 1st deadline that the Trump team had been promoting with aggressive fervor, rendering it little more than a paper tiger. The implications were profound. More than 35% of Canada's critical exports, steel, aluminum, lumber, automobiles, energy, were already reeling under U.S. tariffs ranging from 25% to 35%. It was a barrage that seemed poised to force Ottawa into submission, compelling them to bend to Washington's will to avoid economic devastation. But submission was not in the cards. As July drew to a close, Canada maintained a deliberate silence, a strategic quietude that belied the furious activity behind closed doors. Negotiations continued in hushed tones, with no visible concessions from the Canadian side. Officials in Ottawa made it crystal clear they would not sacrifice long-term strategic interests for the sake of a hasty, face-saving agreement. While Trump ramped up the tariff threats in an attempt to bully Canada into compliance, Ottawa's resolve only hardened. What fueled this unshakable confidence? How did Canada transform from a seemingly vulnerable trading partner into a nation pivoting boldly toward Europe and Asia, reshaping the entire trade battlefield? The answer lies in the deft maneuvers orchestrated by Prime Minister Mark Carney since Trump's return to the Oval Office, a series of moves that have not only neutralized immediate pressures, but also redefined the power dynamics in North American trade relations. From the outset of his tenure, Carney signaled that Canada's no-rush-to-sign approach was no mere procrastination or indecision. It was a meticulously calculated strategy, rooted in a deep understanding of economic leverage and geopolitical timing. He articulated it plainly: Canada would not yield simply to appease a deadline. Any agreement must genuinely serve the nation's best interests, safeguarding its future prosperity against the whims of a U.S. administration prone to shifting the goalposts mid-game. When Washington unleashed its initial salvos, 25% tariffs on automobiles, steel, and aluminum, with threats to escalate to 35% for non-compliant goods under the USMCA framework, Carney eschewed the dramatic responses that might have been expected. There were no fiery press conferences or public outbursts. Instead, Ottawa mounted a quiet counteroffensive, one that demonstrated remarkable foresight and preparation. Provinces at the epicenter of the trade storm, such as Ontario's industrial powerhouse and Alberta's oil-rich heartland, stood firm from the beginning. They had long anticipated a full-scale tariff war and were ready to weather it. Canadian businesses, far from being caught off guard, had contingency plans in place, bolstered by government support programs tailored for vulnerable sectors like automotive, energy, and steel. An impressive $8 billion Canadian dollar worker protection fund was activated to mitigate the human cost of these tariffs, providing a safety net for those affected. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction born of panic, it was the activation of a comprehensive national economic defense strategy, one that had been honed in anticipation of just such a confrontation. Carney's masterstroke was in refusing to engage on Trump's accelerated timeline. By extending negotiations silently and methodically, he placed Washington in a reactive posture. The longer the U.S. waited, the more domestic pressures mounted south of the border. American consumers began to feel the sting as inflation crept upward, driven by higher costs for imported goods. Public dissatisfaction with the tariffs grew, manifesting in grumbles at gas pumps and construction sites alike. By late July, talks persisted in Washington and Toronto, but the impasse held firm. Carney reiterated his stance with calm assurance: "We will use all the time available to reach the best possible deal, not sign hastily just to meet a deadline." The Trump administration's impatience was palpable, culminating in the president's candid admission that he no longer anticipated a deal before August 1st. He even floated the idea of unilaterally imposing that 35% tariff, bypassing further talks altogether. The crux of this drama lay in Washington's miscalculation. The U.S. had banked on Ottawa panicking under the escalating tariffs, rushing to the table to avert immediate economic pain. But Carney, with his background as a seasoned economist and former Bank of England governor, understood the perils of short-term concessions. A rushed deal could erode Canada's sovereignty and economic autonomy for years to come, so he inverted the paradigm. The no-rush-to-sign strategy evolved into a defensive fortress, ensnaring the U.S. in a protracted waiting game. Meanwhile, Canada seized the opportunity to forge bilateral ties with Europe, the Middle East and Asia, diminishing its reliance on the North American market. This pivot wasn't just reactive, it was transformative, catching observers off guard and fundamentally altering the negotiation landscape. No longer could the U.S. dictate terms from a position of unchallenged dominance. Carney had wrested control of the tempo, turning time itself into a weapon. What began as a defiant declaration had matured into a testament to Ottawa's astute diplomatic acumen in the cutthroat arena of 21st century trade warfare. By the middle of 2025, Carney's vision had blossomed into an expansive global diplomatic offensive. Over 80 bilateral meetings with world leaders underscored Canada's determination to wield time as a strategic asset, building alliances that extended far beyond its borders. Rather than remaining ensnared in U.S. dependency, Ottawa committed to amplifying its influence across Asia and Europe. A pivotal milestone came in early July when Canada dispatched its inaugural LNG shipment to South Korea from the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, British Columbia. This marked the nation's debut as an LNG exporter, with an initial capacity of 6.5 million tons annually, set to double to 14 million tons upon completion. The shipment, loaded on June 30th, inaugurated a vital trans-Pacific energy corridor, a $40 billion endeavor backed by a consortium including Shell, Petronas, Mitsubishi, PetroChina, and Kogas. This venture wasn't merely about diversification, it was a direct challenge to U.S. dominance in North American energy supplies. By establishing alternative outlets, Canada eroded Washington's ability to leverage gas as a bargaining tool. Simultaneously, in Europe, Canada's uranium exports surged, positioning the country as a strategic powerhouse. Cameco, the nation's premier uranium producer, boosted output to nearly 37 million pounds in 2024, capturing about 15% of the global market and directing over 80% of exports to Europe and Asia. As the world's second-largest uranium producer after Kazakhstan, holding a 14 to 15% market share, Canada wielded this resource as a potent ace. U.S. tech behemoths like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft grew increasingly reliant on supplies from Saskatchewan, granting Ottawa a subtle yet significant bargaining chip in its dealings with Washington. Analysts at Reuters highlighted the risks. A 10% U.S. tariff on Canadian energy could inflate domestic uranium prices by up to 10%, constrained by rigid long-term contracts. The upward trajectory of Canadian mining stocks reflected investor sentiment, with capital flowing into gold and uranium as hedges against trade volatility. Broader economic indicators painted a similar picture. Government data showed Canada's export share to the U.S. plummeting from 78% to 68% between May 2024 and May 2025, equating to over 7.7 billion Canadian dollars in diverted trade. In contrast, exports to the EU, UK, Australia, Indonesia, and Japan skyrocketed by 42%. While this surge hadn't fully compensated for the U.S. losses, it signaled a deliberate shift toward a multipolar trade framework. Carney's pivot strategy exemplified this evolution. He didn't merely evade the pitfalls of a premature agreement, he constructed an entirely new global arena. From LNG flows to South Korea, to uranium deliveries to France and the EU, Canada harnessed its natural resource endowments as leverage points. Should Washington persist with tariff escalations, Ottawa retained the capacity to retaliate through these channels, backed by robust alternative markets and alliances. This maneuver elevated a subdued negotiation with the U.S. to a commanding presence on the international energy stage. It underscored the efficacy of intelligent economic diplomacy. When dependency on America wanes, so does Washington's grip. Carney had ingeniously converted a stalling tactic into a comprehensive global realignment, empowering Canada to confront the tariff onslaught without compromising its enduring interests. On June 26, 2025, the One Canadian Economy Act, known as Bill C-5, took effect, a domestic initiative that amplified Canada's defiance and turned the tables inward. This legislation wasn't a passive shield against U.S. aggression, it was an offensive reconfiguration of the nation's economic architecture. Comprising two core elements, Bill C-5 dismantled long-standing barriers to internal cohesion and accelerated vital projects. The Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act eradicated inter-provincial trade obstacles, previously akin to a concealed 6.9% tax due to disparate professional standards and regulations. Now, with mutual recognition across provinces, goods, services, and labor flowed unimpeded, potentially boosting GDP by up to 4% annually, or roughly 200 billion Canadian dollars in added value. Complementing this was the Building Canada Act, which streamlined approval processes for national priorities like energy infrastructure and mining, compressing timelines from 5 years to just 2. Carney heralded this as a boon for efficiency, establishing a specialized federal agency to expedite large-scale endeavors, curtail bureaucracy, and instill investor confidence. Parliament framed it as an essential countermeasure to the tariff-induced economic turbulence. As U.S. tariffs climbed from 25% to 35% on commodities like steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber, Ottawa refused to idle. Instead, it re-engineered supply chains domestically, prioritizing local sourcing, ramping up internal production, and broadening export horizons beyond American borders. At the bargaining table, Canada eschewed a one-size-fits-all free trade pact, opting for targeted, sector-specific accords. Take softwood lumber, a perennial flashpoint where U.S. duties had long stifled Canadian exports, and Ottawa had resisted quotas. Now Canada engaged on its terms, consenting to discussions in return for substantive yields. As U.S. construction expenses ballooned under lumber tariffs, even GOP stalwarts in Congress voiced doubts about Trump's approach, fracturing his domestic support. Canada, without capitulating, exploited this division, converting external pressure into avenues for internal fortification. Bill C-5 transcended mere crisis management, it forged a blueprint for self-sufficiency and integration. By alleviating provincial frictions, hastening approvals, and laying a sturdy foundation for strategic initiatives, it equipped Canada to endure further U.S. escalations or sidestep unfavorable pacts. In the midst of a tariff skirmish where Washington presumed superiority, Carney orchestrated a domestic revolution. This act wasn't solely a bulwark against American coercion, it was a visionary scheme for a unified, export-oriented Canada poised to engage the world on equal terms. When reliance on an opponent diminishes, their dominance evaporates. Thus, Canada commandeered the narrative in its showdown with its colossal southern neighbor. The days of Canada perpetually recalibrating to U.S. whims are fading, at least under Carney's stewardship. Ottawa has transitioned from passive response to proactive strategy, encompassing internal reforms, industrial enhancements, and a sprawling web of partnerships spanning Europe, Asia, and South America. No longer a mere adjunct to the American economy, Canada approaches negotiations as a self-assured sovereign, crystal clear on its objectives and assets. As tariffs rain down from Washington, new markets beckon from afar. As trade walls rise in the U.S., domestic fortitude surges in Canada. In this intricate geopolitical chess match, Canada isn't passively awaiting favors, it's asserting parity. Should this trajectory persist, Washington may find itself increasingly isolated, grappling with inflated steel prices, soaring housing costs, and constrained uranium access, all courtesy of its northern counterpart. The question lingers, is Carney methodically constructing a post-American alliance, one that diminishes U.S. hegemony in trade? Or could Trump engineer a seismic shift, transcending mere tariff bluster to reclaim the upper hand? The unfolding saga promises twists aplenty, a riveting chapter in the annals of North American relations, where economic savvy meets political brinkmanship. As we delve deeper into these developments, it's worth reflecting on the broader ripple effects across the continent. Trump's tariff strategy, born from a desire to resurrect American manufacturing and correct perceived trade imbalances, has inadvertently spurred Canada to accelerate its diversification efforts. This isn't just about economics, it's a profound shift in alliances and power structures. For American businesses reliant on Canadian imports, think automakers sourcing steel or tech firms needing uranium, these tariffs translate to higher costs passed on to consumers, fueling inflation and eroding public support for protectionist policies. Polls in the U.S. have begun to show cracks in Trump's base, particularly in Rust Belt states where tariff backlash hits hardest. Carney's approach, by contrast, embodies a blend of pragmatism and vision. His no-rush-to-sign mantra isn't stubbornness, it's a recognition that true leverage comes from options. By courting Asian markets like South Korea and Japan, Canada isn't abandoning North America but hedging against its volatility. The LNG export to South Korea, for instance, isn't a one-off, it's the vanguard of a sustained push into Pacific energy trade where demand for clean fuels is insatiable. Similarly, uranium's role in powering data centers for AI and cloud computing makes Canada indispensable to global tech ecosystems, giving Ottawa a voice in conversations far beyond trade disputes. Domestically, Bill C-5's impact reverberates through everyday Canadian life. Imagine a welder in Alberta seamlessly relocating to a job in Ontario without bureaucratic hurdles, or a mining project in Saskatchewan breaking ground in record time. These changes foster unity in a federation often plagued by regional divides, turning potential weaknesses into strengths. For the U.S., this means negotiating with a more cohesive partner, one less prone to internal fractures that Washington might exploit. Looking ahead, the August 1st deadline's evaporation marks a watershed. Trump's threats, once formidable, now echo with diminishing force as Canada demonstrates resilience. If negotiations drag on, American industries could lobby harder for relief, pressuring the administration to soften its stance. Carney, meanwhile, continues his diplomatic marathon, perhaps eyeing free trade pacts with emerging economies or deepening ties with the EU post-Brexit. The message is clear. In an interconnected world, isolationism backfires. This episode illuminates timeless lessons in international relations. Power isn't solely about size or military might, it's about adaptability and foresight. Canada, with its vast resources and strategic location, is leveraging both to carve a path independent of U.S. whims. For Americans watching from afar, it's a reminder that trade wars have no true winners, only varying degrees of loss. As Carney builds his multipolar vision, Trump must decide whether to double down on confrontation or seek mutual gains. The stakes couldn't be higher and the world is watching.